we can talk about has to deal primarily with the South. And it's a spread out of those African Americans from some colonies into some of the other colonies. It's primarily a southern migration.
Yes, going towards the South, not away from the South, really from the East Coast to the South. However, of course, slavery ended and we got into the period of Reconstruction, which during that time, you still had about 91% of people of African descent living in the South. However, of course, we know that Reconstruction ended. And at the end of the Reconstruction period and getting into the early 1880s, there were about 5 million blacks in the United States. And again, 90% of those lived in what's defined as the South. However, at the end of Reconstruction, lots of bad things started to happen to black people in the South. And so that began the period of what's called the Exodusters migration. This is a migration that's not really talked about, and that is when blacks left en masse from parts of the South and went to the West, to Kansas, to Texas, to Oklahoma, and they established all black towns and all black cities, and even they founded parts of what is now Houston, Texas, which began as an Exodusters migration, ex-slaves moving west. In fact, Nashville plays a big role. What was believed to be the largest Exodusters migration started right here in Nashville, as approximately 60,000 disgruntled blacks left here en masse and went west. And if you think about it, 60,000 blacks in Nashville over 100 years ago, in terms of what percentage of the population that might have been, we might have 250,000 blacks in the whole metropolitan area here today. So just think about a quarter, that would be a quarter of the black population today. So I imagine at that time that was almost nearly all of the African Americans in Middle Tennessee up and left en masse all at once. So that's significant.
You know, Dr. Padgett, you mentioned these small black towns that were a result of migration from the South to the West. Let's say some other things about these small black towns, because I think that you see them in almost every state here and there. And if you would like to, why don't you name a couple of them so that we can more closely identify them, and how were they constituted, and how did they come into being? Some of them, you know, in terms of just a general statement in reference to them.
Well, some of them probably don't exist today, but you had Nicodemus, Kansas. There's a town called Winona in Texas, which is still a small town outside of Tyler, Texas, but that was founded by freed Africans. Also, some of the wards in downtown Houston, once again, were founded by people of African descent who were moving towards the West. So those are just 3 examples of these towns. There are a lot of towns called free towns in parts of Oklahoma and other places in the West that are just remnants of this Exodus movement.
And so generally, many of us generally see the exodus or the movement of African Americans primarily from the South to the North. But what you're saying is that even before the Northern migration, that there's a considerable migration of African Americans that will go out west rather than to go south. What are some of the things, what are some of the motivations for them moving from the South into the West from that perspective?
Well, the end of Reconstruction, where you had blacks being lynched, killed, forced off their land. The Associated Press has just released a story that I've been reading about how blacks lost hundreds of thousands of acres of land that was just stolen from them, and in some cases the state governments took the land. It wasn't just the Klan. So under those conditions, people had lots of good reasons to leave, even though they were leaving to what could be termed unexplored, untested territory. Anything was better than the situations under which they were living in the South at that time.
And so this exodus that went from the South, heading first to the West, was one that was primarily driven by really, in a real sense, fear of remaining where they were. I would imagine better opportunities might have also played some role, but more than anything, you think that fear was the motivating factor that forced many of them out of the South after Reconstruction.
Yeah, well, that and the westward expansion was occurring during that time, And what's interesting is that a lot of blacks were chastised for leaving. People said, well, stay here in the South, don't go west. And so they were chastised for leaving, many of them.
Okay, and of course, Dr. Patrick, let us take this first commercial break, after which we'll come back and resume this conversation. We'll be back with you following this short commercial break.